There are stories buried so deep beneath the soil of America's past that even the worms forget them. But in the quiet town of Marion County, Illinois, the ground never stopped whispering. Locals still avoid the woods past Bell Creek, not for what they might see, but for what once sat there, watching. In 1840, the Bellows family lived on the edge of civilization, and they preferred it that way. Isolated, private, some would say secretive. But what they did behind those wooden walls was not just strange, it was profane. The first sheriff to investigate the property in the fall of that year would never speak publicly about what he found. His journal, however, survived, and in it he wrote one sentence that history tried to erase. The family eats with their dead. Not ate, eats. Present tense. The Bellows weren't mourners. They were participants. That house, which no longer stands, held a table carved from oak so dark it reflected nothing. Around it sat 7 chairs, 6 used, one always draped in a shroud. Underneath the floorboards, the bones didn't belong to animals. And yet, for decades, every official record scrubbed this family clean. Their land passed from one investor to the next, no mention of the screams heard on winter nights or the smell of rotting perfume that poured through the chimney. This is not a ghost story. This is a documented mystery, one so uncomfortable that state archivists in the 1930s redacted entire ledgers under federal order. Why? Because the Bellows weren't just reclusive, they were connected. The father, Horace Bellows, held a ledger of his own, names, dates, transactions, not of money, but of lives, visitors that never returned, travelers who vanished without a trace between St. Louis and Chicago, every third name marked with a red X, and one word beside it, consumed. Some say the family practiced a forgotten rite, older than the Bible, buried in the bones of Mesopotamian sacrifice and European blood rituals, but others, including one excommunicated priest, claimed it was something worse, something learned, taught, passed down through a secret society that understood how to manipulate grief into control. The Bellows didn't just host the dead, they harvested the emotional energy of mourning like currency, and dinner was the ritual. You're not supposed to know this, but now you do, and the descent has already begun. In the winter of 1841, a traveling peddler named Elias Trumbull vanished along the route that cut past the Bellows property. He was a man known for never missing a sale, and even more known for his iron discipline. He kept records, detailed logs of every stop. His last entry was dated December 17th. Stopped at Bellows, invited for supper. He was never seen again. No body, no cart, no trace. The sheriff, pressured by Trumbull's brother, reluctantly opened an investigation. What he found inside the Bellows home was not evidence, but something else. The dining table was still set for 7. A fresh place arranged across from a decaying seat, wood swollen from years of something wet seeping into it. In the hearth, meat boiled in a rusted cauldron. The aroma was sickly sweet. When the sheriff asked about Elias, Horace Bellows reportedly smiled without blinking and said, "He offered himself." The investigation was closed within a week. The sheriff resigned and left Illinois altogether. His resignation letter was one sentence: "They are not of our time." What did he mean? Some believe the Bellows family didn't operate on the same timeline as the rest of us. Diaries from nearby farmers speak of strange lights around the Bellows home, of guests arriving in carriages that made no sound, wheels spinning without touching earth. One account describes a hymn, sung at midnight, that echoed across the snow-covered hills in a language no one could place, not Latin, not German, not English. A linguist from Ohio once called it a dialect of Sumerian long thought extinct. But what is a family in 1840s Illinois doing singing hymns older than civilization? The answer came years later when a child, 9-year-old Margaret Holloway, escaped the property. Filthy, starved, clutching a hand-carved doll with eyes sewn shut. She claimed she had been a guest of the people of the table. When asked what they did to her, she only said, "They fed me lies until I tasted the truth." She died 2 weeks later in her sleep. Brain hemorrhage, the doctor said. No trauma, no infection, just collapse. Her final words were reportedly whispered to the town priest. "The dead speak louder when you listen with your hunger." The Bellows were never arrested, no charges, no trial. because by then every official who dared enter that home had either gone mad or disappeared. By spring of 1842, word of the Bellows family had spread beyond McLean County. But it wasn't lawmen or journalists that came calling. It was a man named Thaddeus Crane. Not a marshal, not a reverend. He called himself an investigator of the unaccountable. He arrived in a black carriage with no driver, carrying a trunk full of books bound in skin and marked with glyphs etched so deep they looked burned into the covers. Thaddeus checked into the local inn, room 7, and for 3 nights lights could be seen under his door long past midnight, the sound of scratching pens and muttered prayers leaking into the hall. On the 4th morning, he approached the Bellows house alone. He left behind a letter, sealed and addressed to whoever has eyes to see. The contents of that letter wouldn't surface for decades, but the innkeeper's daughter who cleaned his room recalled the words scrawled across his mirror in red ink. "Truth rots in plain air. They've preserved it." When Thaddeus entered the Bellows home, it was 9:04 a.m. Witnesses said the sky darkened within minutes. Birds went silent. No one dared follow him, but the black carriage remained outside for exactly 1 hour and 11 minutes. Then, movement. The front door creaked open and a boy stepped out, barefoot, shirtless, and covered in ash. He held a human tooth in his hand, clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Behind him, silence. No sign of Thaddeus, no screams, no farewell. The boy walked past the carriage, past the fields, into the woods, and vanished. The carriage stayed 3 more days. Then, on the morning of the 4th, it was gone. No sound, no tracks, as if it had never been. Rumors exploded. Some said Thaddeus had been devoured, not by beasts, but by memories. That the Bellows family had ways of rewriting what a man believed about time, self, and soul. That once they showed you, you could never return. Man, you didn't die. You just stopped being you. One witness, an old farmer named Jeb Collins, claimed he saw Thaddeus days later walking into the Bellows barn with his face removed like a mask peeled away, nothing underneath but raw light. He whispered one phrase before disappearing again. "They don't eat the body. They eat the pattern." Jeb never spoke again. They found him a week later, eyes burned out, mouth sewn shut with his own hair. Sheriff Malcolm Tate had dealt with murderers, thieves, and even the occasional drifter who claimed to speak with angels, but nothing prepared him for the Bellows. After Thaddeus vanished, the townspeople demanded action, and Malcolm, a man who'd never flinched at gunfire, mounted his horse and rode to the edge of the Bellows farm. What he saw made him stop cold. The crops were wrong. Perfect rows of corn that shimmered as if coated in glass, yet none bore ears. Just hollow stalks, brittle and humming. He dismounted and walked the rest of the way, boots crunching over black soil that smelled not of earth but of vinegar and rot. He reached the porch. The door stood open, just like it had for Thaddeus. Inside, a low hum pulsed through the air like breathing, but deeper, slower, as if the house itself had lungs. Malcolm stepped inside. The room was silent but not still. There were no chairs, no tables, just a long wooden plank stretched across sawhorses in the center of the room. Upon it, a woman's body, naked, grey, her eyes wide open, not rotting, preserved, mouth stitched closed with thread so fine it shimmered in the candlelight. Carved into her skin were names, dozens of them. He leaned closer. They weren't Bellows family names. They were the names of townspeople, living ones, including his own. He stumbled back, heart hammering, and that's when he heard it. The floor above creaked, a soft shuffle. Then, childlike laughter, but wrong. Too slow, like a record dragging at half speed. He drew his revolver and called out. No answer, just the sound of something descending the stairs on all fours. Not footsteps, clicks, nails. He backed out of the house, tripped on the porch rail, and fell hard. As he scrambled to his feet, he saw them, 7 figures standing in the field, motionless. All children, all barefoot, all smiling. But their eyes weren't right. Too large, too bright. Malcolm fled. He never filed a report. But 3 days later he was found hanging in his barn, throat wrapped in an apron that didn't belong to his household, carved into his chest. "She sees you when you dream." The coroner said it was suicide, but his wife swore he hadn't slept in days, kept whispering about music only he could hear, notes that made his teeth hurt and his bones itch. The Bellows didn't just haunt, they recorded, and once they had your name, they rewrote your ending. After Sheriff Malcolm Tate's death, whispers crept through the cracks of every cabin and saloon in Morgan County. The Bellows place was no longer spoken of directly. Instead, townsfolk gestured vaguely to the east and lowered their voices when passing rumors. But not everyone could stay away. Reverend Amos Trundle, a man of logic masked in faith, believed the devil worked only when fear gave him soil. So he rode out alone, clutching his Bible tighter than his saddle. What he found at the Bellows property would unravel both his reason and his God. The house stood silent as if waiting, but Amos didn't knock. He stepped through the door with a sermon on his tongue and fire in his spine. Inside, the air tasted metallic, and each breath felt stolen. The preserved woman was gone. In her place stood a chair, high-backed, carved with intricate runes that didn't belong to any language known to the Reverend. On the chair, sitting perfectly still, was a child, a boy, 10, maybe 11. But his eyes were old, not just wise, ancient, watching. Amos asked the boy where his parents were. No response, just a slow, deliberate pointing finger toward the cellar. Against his instincts, Amos opened the door and descended. The stairs seemed deeper than they should have been, each creak echoing like cannon fire. At the bottom, he found shelves stacked not with preserves or tools, but with skulls, labeled, tagged like books in a library. Each one bore the name of a townsperson now missing or dead. On the far wall, a large black mirror hung crooked, wrapped in barbed wire. Its surface rippled like water. As Amos stepped closer, he didn't see his reflection. Instead, he saw a version of himself bound to that chair upstairs, mouth sewn shut, eyes removed, screaming silently. He turned to flee, but the boy was already behind him, still silent, still pointing. Only now, the child's other hand held a spoon, and he was stirring it slowly in an empty bowl. With every stir, Amos felt his memories bleed. His name, his church, his childhood, all slipping away. By the time he reached his horse, he no longer remembered why he'd come. He wandered into the forest, eyes glassy, lips moving in prayer that made no sense. They found his Bible weeks later in the bell tower, every page rewritten, not with scripture, but with musical notes etched in a hand too small for a man. And on the final page, one by one, they learned to serve the table. By the winter of 1841, snow buried the roads in Morgan County, sealing the town in a kind of silence that felt imposed, not natural. People stopped attending church. The blacksmith boarded up his shop and left a note nailed to the door, "Something watches from the fields." But no one removed the note, not even the sheriff's deputy, who now drank until morning and slept through noon. Meanwhile, the Bellows home remained lit each night, a single window glowing a soft amber that flickered as though from a fire that never died. No smoke ever rose from the chimney, no footprints ever marked the snow, but always that light. The town's schoolteacher, Clara Whitlow, began recording her dreams in a diary that would later be found buried beneath floorboards of her home, charred at the edges. In them, she described a dinner table of infinite length stretching through a blackened forest. At its head sat a mother-shaped figure, wrapped in funeral gauze, feeding invisible children who wept without sound. Each dream ended with her reflection vanishing from a nearby mirror and being replaced by a version of herself with no mouth. Clara stopped sleeping. Then she stopped speaking. And one morning she simply walked into the snow barefoot and never returned. A search party followed her trail for several miles until it ended abruptly in a ring of bare earth, still warm. At the center, a single dinner plate with a fingerbone arranged carefully atop it, pointing back toward town. By spring, more families had vanished. Whole homes left intact, but meals unfinished, candles still burning low. It was as if they'd stood up mid-sentence and stepped into a tear in the world. Only children remained behind, mute, pale, sitting still in chairs facing blank walls. Some clutched spoons, others hummed lullabies that no one recognized. The town council voted to burn the Bellows house, believing that fear lame could end what reason could not. A dozen men rode out, torches raised. But when they reached the property, they found the home had changed. It was now 2 stories taller, windows bricked up, doors sealed, and surrounding it were dozens of chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each holding a porcelain doll that looked eerily like one of the town's lost. The fire wouldn't catch. The wood refused to burn. And from somewhere deep within the house, a dinner bell rang once, then twice, then silence. The men dropped their torches and never spoke of that night again. By midsummer, what remained of Hollow Creek was no longer a town, but a rumor with a post office. The children who had stayed behind began aging strangely, some developing gray hair by 9, others speaking Latin they'd never been taught. The air around the Bellows property shifted too. Birds no longer flew over it, dogs refused to approach. The soil within a mile radius turned chalk white and crops blackened overnight. But still, that upper window glowed every night, with its flickering amber light like a lantern hung in a crypt. No one dared speak the name Bellows anymore, not even in whispers. Reverend Ellison, a man who once claimed God walked beside him, set fire to his own church, shouting, "She feeds on memory," before he ran into the flames and disappeared. By fall, the town's doctor, Nathaniel Brigg, decided he'd investigate the house alone. He kept a journal, clinical, skeptical, full of rational notes, until his last entry simply read, "The dead are not dead. They only wait for the proper invitation." His body was never recovered, but his coat was found on the Bellows doorstep, folded neatly with every button sewn shut from the inside. Then came the knocking. It started on the edge of town. 3 knocks at each door just before midnight. No one was ever seen doing it. Some opened, most didn't. Those who did were never the same. One man, a trapper named Saul Daring, opened his door and saw only his childhood kitchen, his long-dead mother seated at the table. She looked up and said, "Eat, Saul. You're so thin." He screamed for 5 days straight before swallowing his own tongue. The sheriff tried to evacuate the town, but the roads out were now looping. No matter which way you turned, you ended up at the town square where the statue of founder Elias Hollow now wept real blood. His name had been carved out and replaced with the word host. In a final attempt at salvation, a few men set dynamite beneath the Bellows home. The blast shook the hills and sent ash into the sky, but when the smoke cleared, the house still stood. Only now the upper window was open. A lace curtain waved gently in the breeze, and from within, a woman's voice called out softly, "Supper's ready." Then the air grew cold, and the silence impossibly deeper. The silence that followed was not absence of sound, but a presence in itself, heavy, watching, intelligent. Those who lingered near the Bellows property described it as if the air had weight, pressing against their skin like wet wool. No birds returned, and even insects avoided the soil, which had turned a peculiar shade of grey-green like decayed parchment. At the general store, Amos Wren, a man who hadn't spoken in years due to shell shock from the war, began muttering scripture in reverse. He gouged out his eyes one morning after waking from a dream in which he claimed the family at the table had opened their mouths to speak, but no words came, only teeth. At the edge of the forest, trees started twisting unnaturally, growing in spiral patterns that locals said matched ancient burial sigils traced back to the old world. One family, the Harrows, tried to leave. They packed up their cart, hitched their horses, and by dawn were gone, or so everyone thought. At twilight, the same cart returned driverless, horses dragging a tangle of splintered wood and something beneath a burlap tarp that was humming. When Sheriff Withers removed the covering, he dropped to his knees. The bodies were there, yes, but they had fused into each other, mouths sewn shut, eyes open, all facing west toward the Bellows house. No blood, no smell, just the faint scent of roses and vinegar. Then came the children's voices. Only at night, only near the property, and only when you were alone. They didn't cry or scream. They laughed, softly, in rhythm, as if practicing something. A man named Judd Parson, a known drunk, followed the laughter one night carrying a lantern and a hunting knife. At dawn, his boots were found at the threshold of the Bellows front porch, neatly placed side by side. He had walked barefoot into the house. He was never seen again. From that day, no one approached the property. It was understood without agreement that the house wanted to be left alone. Yet its presence grew. Paint peeled off every house in Hollow Creek within weeks. Wells dried up. Mirrors no longer showed reflections, only a grey blur. People began hearing their names spoken softly behind them, but when they turned, nothing. The town wasn't dying. It was unraveling, quietly, surgically from within, as if reality itself was being edited by some unseen ancient author whose story had only just begun. Sheriff Withers stopped speaking altogether. His once firm, commanding voice, a voice that had calmed riots and quelled brawls, had vanished after the Harrow's cart returned. He took to sitting outside his office, rocking slowly in a chair that creaked like bones shifting in their graves. He scribbled endlessly into a ledger no one else was allowed to see, pages filled not with words but symbols, circles within triangles, eyes above thrones, trees growing upside down. When Reverend Thomas tried to pray over the Bellows land from a safe distance, the ground shook so violently that the steeple of his church cracked in two. That Sunday, only 3 people showed up to service, and all 3 claimed they felt watched not by something human but by something older, ancient and hungry. Meanwhile, the Bellows house never decayed. Its windows, once clouded, now gleamed. The wood seemed polished, like the house was being cared for by invisible hands. Some said they saw a flicker of candlelight at night in the upstairs room. Others swore they saw silhouettes seated at the dinner table, unmoving, heads turned toward the front door as if waiting for someone. And then came the letters, folded with impossible precision, sealed with wax that smelled of burnt sage and iron. No address, no postage, just one name written in calligraphy that no one recognized, and always the same message inside: "You have been invited to dine." Those who received them either left town immediately or locked themselves in their homes, windows boarded, prayers muttered with every breath. But it didn't help. Days later, they'd vanish, always at night, no signs of forced entry, just a lingering aroma of roasted meat and dried lilies. One boy, 13 years old, claimed he saw his mother sleepwalk into the forest. He followed her, clutching his father's revolver, only to find her kneeling before a mirror placed against a tree. She was smiling at it, not at herself, at something else in the reflection. When she turned to face him, her eyes weren't hers. They were blue, pale blue, Bellows blue. The boy fired, but the bullet never reached her. It froze mid-air and dropped like a stone. He ran until his feet bled, and by the time he returned home, the house was gone. Not burned, not ransacked, gone. Erased like chalk wiped from a slate, and in its place a note nailed into the earth with a fork. She is home now. By autumn of 1840, the surrounding counties had begun whispering of a curse that bled outward from the Bellows estate like a black vein through Illinois soil. Crops withered in fields that had once been fertile for generations. Cattle gave birth to malformed calves with human-like teeth. Birds circled overhead but never landed. Ministers from other towns came to cleanse the area, some with holy water, others with fire. None returned. One preacher named Elias Rowe sent a telegram before his disappearance, just 4 words: "It watches from within." Panic overtook Sedgwick Hollow. Families fled in wagons piled with furniture and children, but those who tried to leave at night never made it past the county line. The roads would twist into unfamiliar paths, landmarks would vanish, and eventually those who escaped came back to find their homes untouched, as if they'd never tried to leave at all. The Bellows house sat unchanged. It never aged, never crumbled. Some began to believe it wasn't a house anymore, not really. More like a gate, or a mask, or a body hiding something else inside. A few brave or desperate souls ventured in with lanterns and guns. All of them vanished except for one: Ezra Finch, a war veteran who'd survived Antietam. When he came back out, he was barefoot and bald, every tooth in his mouth missing. He muttered endlessly about a meal that eats you back and a man in a chair who never blinks. They locked Ezra in the county asylum, where he starved to death days later, his body contorted into a sitting position, arms posed as if holding invisible utensils. Sheriff Withers finally snapped. He barricaded the Bellows property with firewood soaked in oil, intending to burn the entire house to ash. But the fire wouldn't catch. No matter how many torches he threw, the flames curled away like they were afraid. When he stepped too close, his skin blistered, not from heat, but from cold. A biting, ancient cold that felt like it came from beneath the ground. That night the sheriff vanished, and in his place the chair he always rocked in was found in the Bellows dining room, set at the head of the table, polished, waiting, and nailed into the wood was another note, same elegant script. "You are seated now." From that moment the town no longer called it Sedgwick Hollow. On every map, official or otherwise, the name was scratched out, as though the land itself rejected the memory. But the invitations continued, and each one still read, "You have been invited to dine." The last known outsider to willingly approach the Bellows estate was Dr. Horace Linwood, a scholar of death rituals who had studied burial rites from the catacombs of Paris to the temples of Cambodia. He arrived in December 1840, drawn not by superstition, but by an academic obsession with what he called ritualistic preservation of the familial corpse. Linwood believed the Bellows weren't mad. They were participating in an ancient, possibly forgotten cultural practice. He came with journals, sketchpads, and a promise to publish his findings. He was confident, methodical, and arrogant enough to believe that knowledge could protect him. He was wrong. The townspeople watched from a distance as he crossed the threshold. He left a note with the postmaster. "If I do not return in 3 nights, publish my notes and do not come looking." That note never needed to be mailed. On the 4th morning, the postmaster found a package on his doorstep tied with black twine and sealed with wax. Inside, Linwood's notebooks, every page blank, except one. Scrawled across the center in what appeared to be dried blood. "We don't bury what we love. We seat it." That same day, the bells of the abandoned Sedgwick church began to ring on their own. No rope, no wind. Just 12 slow tolls, every day at dusk. Some claimed to see silhouettes behind the dining room windows of the Bellows house. Stiff shapes seated around the table, their heads turning slowly to watch anyone who dared look in. Over time, those who had lived in Sedgwick Hollow or had any ancestral tie to the Bellows began experiencing shared nightmares, always the same dream. Walking down a candlelit hallway lined with portraits that bled from the eyes, leading to a dining room filled with the scent of decay and lavender, and seated at the head of the table, a pale figure smiling through a stitched mouth, gesturing for them to sit. One by one, these descendants either vanished or went mad. A pattern emerged. Those who dreamt were marked, and those marked would eventually hear the knock. 3 taps at the door. No one ever saw who knocked. But when they opened it, there was always a chair waiting just outside, perfectly polished, and an envelope resting on the seat. Inside, "You have been invited to dine." The town council, such as it remained, convened in secret that winter to discuss what could be done. Their priest had fled months ago, babbling about communion with the dead and curses that traveled through bloodlines. The sheriff refused to investigate further after finding his dog torn open and posed like a feast centerpiece on his porch. Desperation grew like mold, quiet and choking. A decision was made not by vote but by silence. They would torch the Bellows estate, erase it. Whatever madness festered within that house, whatever ancient rite or biological curse had taken hold, they would cleanse it with fire. On the night of February the 2nd, 1841, a group of 6 men crept through the woods under a new moon. They carried torches soaked in oil and prayers half remembered from childhood. But as they approached the clearing, the estate looked different. The windows glowed from within, though no one lived there, no one living anyway. They paused at the edge of the tree line, suddenly paralyzed. The air thickened. Each man would later describe a pressure, like a pair of unseen hands gripping the sides of their heads, whispering in a tongue that sounded like their mother's voice but spoke words they'd never heard. Still, they pressed on, lighting the perimeter with shaking hands. Flames licked the wooden walls, and for a moment it seemed the nightmare would end in smoke and ash. But then the fire stopped. Not was extinguished. Stopped. Mid-burn. The flames bent backward as if inhaled by the house itself. Then the house sighed. A long, low groan, timber and brick vibrating like lungs exhaling. The torches went out all at once. The men fled, 2 of them dropping dead by morning with no visible wounds. The others went mute. And then the letters came. Every man who had touched a match received a handwritten note the following week. Same paper, same ink, same message. The dead. Do not fear fire. The table is set. Their families began to suffer. Illness. Shadows. The sound of cutlery clinking in empty rooms. The Bellows house didn't just survive, it thrived. The grass around it grew greener, the paint on the shutters looked fresh, but inside, no one moved. Or rather, no one moved until someone looked directly at it. And then the shadows at the table would turn, always at once, always slowly, always smiling. Months passed, and the Bellows estate became a scar that no map would dare mark. The children in town stopped speaking its name, as if the very syllables might summon something ancient and watching. Farmers began abandoning their land when livestock were found with their eyes sewn shut, arranged in circles facing toward the Bellows property. One man, Ezekiel Crane, tried to profit from the growing fear. He was a traveling photographer from St. Louis, lured by the rumors of the house that wouldn't burn. He believed no ghost could haunt a glass plate, no legend could escape the lens. He set up his camera just before dusk on April 9, 1841, positioning it perfectly to capture the house from a safe distance. The locals warned him, begged him even, but he laughed it off, mocking their superstitions. He snapped 3 photos, each exposure timed and carefully calculated. But when he developed the glass negatives in his mobile darkroom that evening, he found only one image returned. It wasn't of the house. It was of the Bellows family, seated at the dinner table, all 7 of them, including Thomas, the boy who had died first, the one whose body was never found. Their eyes were all open and locked onto the camera, their expressions, not blank, not angry, but waiting. Worse still, behind them in the photo stood Ezekiel Crane himself, not a reflection, not a trick of the glass. He was standing behind them in the frame, smiling, his eyes dull and empty like a marionette with its strings freshly cut. Ezekiel vanished that night. His wagon was found parked outside the woods with all his equipment intact, except for the glass plate, which was shattered into 7 perfect pieces, each piece still showing one member of the Bellows family. From then on, no outsider dared approach. Maps began omitting the road that led to the Bellows home. Government surveyors were turned around by fate, lead compass readings and radio static even decades later. The house faded from memory, but not from existence. In fact, locals claimed it grew more vivid in dreams. They'd see it in flashes during fever, hear the sound of forks scraping porcelain when alone in their kitchens, wake up with the taste of copper in their mouths and the scent of roasted meat hanging in the air. Then came the letters. Not mailed, not delivered by hand, but found. Tucked beneath pillows, inside locked drawers, sealed in jars buried in gardens, all signed in the same slanted handwriting. Abigail Bellows. Each letter was different in content but identical in structure. They began with a date, always from the year 1839, and a warning that began, "To whom this truth shall fall, your eyes are not yet ready, but your blood remembers." The letters described events no one could have known, secrets of townsfolk long dead, affairs, betrayals, confessions whispered at deathbeds that had never been spoken aloud. They ended with a simple request. Bring a chair, set the table, light the candles. We are not yet finished. One such letter found its way into the hands of Sheriff Jeremiah Hunt in 1843. He had not spoken of the Bellows case in 2 years. The memory of the frozen figures at the dinner table still haunted his sleep. But when the letter arrived, wedged inside his rifle case, his hands began to shake. It detailed his own father's last words, which no one else had heard. "You'll never keep the wolves out. You just feed them names." The letter ended, "You have one more meal to attend, Sheriff. You've always had a seat." That night he rode out alone to the Bellows house, armed with his Colt and a flask of whiskey. The townsfolk watched the lantern fade into the trees. He did not return. But weeks later, another letter appeared. This one addressed to the town pastor. It described Jeremiah's ride, his whispered prayers, the final scream that split the trees, and at the bottom of the page, drawn in dried blood, was a map. Not of the Bellows house, of the town. Every home marked, every family named. And beneath it, one word: guests. That's when the sickness started. Not an illness of the body, but of thought. Fathers began forgetting their children's names. Mothers stirred a, "She's into soup." Children carved invisible symbols into barn doors. No one knew where it came from, only that it began when the sheriff disappeared, and when questioned, the afflicted would all say the same thing: "I was just setting the table." By winter of 1843, the town of Elmridge had turned inward, folding in on itself like a dying star. No one spoke of the Bellows family openly anymore, but their name clung to every silence like mold. Doors were locked not out of fear of bandits, but of neighbors. Children stopped playing in the fields, eyes always glancing toward the tree line as if something watched from behind the bark. And still, more letters. Always Abigail's hand, always from impossible places. A rusted tin in a well, tucked in the hollow of a tree struck by lightning, once even sewn into the lining of a minister's coat. Each contained more than words. They held knowledge. One described a secret burial site on Mason Hill. Men dug and found 3 bodies arranged in a triangle, heads removed, teeth replaced with chicken bones. Another letter spoke of the miller's son, claiming he drowned not by accident, but as a trade for silence. His mother wept when the truth emerged. She had made the deal herself. No punishment followed, only more silence, and more names added to the map. One night, Pastor Emery gathered what remained of the town's faithful and held a vigil at the church. Candles flickered in the pews as he read from scripture, voice shaking. But halfway through the sermon, the oil lamps dimmed, not from wind, but as if swallowed. A low, scratching sound echoed from the rafters like nails against bone. Then a voice, unmistakably female, whispered through every ear in the room, "Why do you still pray with full plates?" Panic scattered the congregation, and by dawn the church doors had been nailed shut from the inside. No one claimed to do it. No one reopened them. Pastor Emery was last seen standing at the pulpit, unmoving, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. When they finally forced the door weeks later, the room was empty. No bodies, just a dinner table where the altar used to be. 5 chairs, airs all set, plates clean, candles burned to the wick, and in the center a note in Abigail's hand: "We never left, you did." From that day, the map changed. No longer marked homes, it marked chairs, empty ones, filled ones, and chairs waiting to be pulled out. The town understood then. They weren't witnesses to the curse. They were participants in a meal that never truly ended. Sheriff Elias Dobbins had spent 31 years enforcing the law in Elmridge, but even he had begun to question what exactly law meant in a place where the dead issued invitations and the living obeyed. He hadn't stepped foot near the Bellows property since the night of the storm, but the dreams had started, slowly at first, then nightly. Always the same. A long table, white linens stained with red, chairs filled with pale figures chewing in perfect silence, and Abigail at the head, raising her glass to him, eyes burning like oil lamps. He would wake drenched in sweat, with the metallic taste of soil in his mouth. One morning in early March he found a folded note under his pillow. No footprints, no sign of intrusion, just that familiar looping script. "Come hungry." He said nothing to his wife, just dressed, holstered his pistol, and headed toward the forest. The Bellows estate was supposed to be abandoned, decayed, collapsed by time and rot. But when Elias emerged through the trees, the house stood pristine, chimney smoking, curtains drawn, not a single shingle out of place. The front door opened before he reached it, no one visible inside, but the smell of roasted meat and warm bread drifted out like a spell. Against every instinct he entered. The dining room glowed with candlelight. The same long table from his dreams stretched before him, set for 6, 5 chairs already filled, and at the far end Abigail, young, radiant as if untouched by the decades. She gestured for him to sit. "You're late," she whispered. Elias didn't remember crossing the room, didn't remember his gun falling from his hip, only that he was seated, knife and fork in hand, and the food was hot. The others, he recognized them. Pastor Emery, Martha Ridge, even the undertaker's boy who'd vanished in 39, all smiling, chewing slowly. As he lifted his fork, Elias noticed the mirror at the far end of the room. But there were only 5 reflections. His seat, empty and glass. Abigail leaned forward. "You can't see the dead in mirrors, Sheriff." And with that, the door slammed behind him, sealing shut. No one saw Elias again, but a 6th name appeared on the map that night, etched in the wood beside the altar table. Dobbins. And the chair he'd once filled remained permanently pulled out, waiting for the next guest to sit, to chew, to vanish. The disappearance of Sheriff Elias Dobbins sent tremors through Elmridge, but not the kind that made headlines, more like the silent shift of earth before a sinkhole. No one said his name out loud, not his deputies, not his wife. The Bellows house was quietly erased from maps, removed from land records, its deeds folded into bureaucratic black holes, but it remained, more alive than ever, and the forest around it began to change. Hunters reported deer carcasses suspended in trees, gutted clean but untouched by scavengers. Children whispered about voices echoing from beneath the creek. Laughter, clinking glasses, murmured prayers in languages no longer spoken. Then came the drawings. At the small schoolhouse, 6-year-old Clara Jensen, known for her silence and wide, glassy eyes, began sketching feverishly during lessons. Her pictures showed long tables, hollow-eyed figures, and rooms lit only by candle wax and something that looked like fireflies trapped in jars. One day she handed her teacher a folded sheet with a single sentence scrawled in black crayon. "They don't eat because they're hungry." When asked what it meant, Clara only blinked and said, "The Bellows told me." That night, her parents found her bed empty. No sign of struggle, no footprints. But outside the front door, someone or something had drawn a perfect dinner plate into the dirt, with a fork and knife on either side. From that night on, townspeople started locking their doors with iron nails. Bibles disappeared from shelves and were replaced with handmade charms, twisted wood, dried rosemary, fingers of wax bound in twine. The Bellows name returned, but not in conversation, on church pews, carved by knives and scratched into the backs of mirrors. A new rule emerged. No one walks the forest alone. Not after dusk, not ever. But rules were only lines drawn by the living. And the Bellows, if they had ever truly been alive, had never been particularly respectful of lines. In April, the mailman found a sealed envelope in the town's drop box. No postage, no return address, just the words, "For the feast." Inside, a guest list. 33 names, none of them famous. All of them local, all of them still breathing. For now. At the bottom, in blood-colored ink, a final line. Seats must be filled. Hunger must be honored. Reverend Markham was the first to speak the forbidden aloud. During his final Sunday sermon, he stepped away from the pulpit, eyes sunken, lips trembling with the weight of a truth too long suppressed. "They were never burying their dead," he whispered. "They were preserving them, preparing them." The congregation shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. Outside, a storm gathered like an answer. The Bellows family believed in a theology older than Christ, older than the cross. Not resurrection, but reclamation. They didn't mourn the dead. They fed them. Gasps. A woman fainted. But Markham didn't flinch. He held up a book bound in what looked like stitched leather. "This," he said, "was found behind the altar, hidden since 1841. A ledger of meals, recipes for preservation, notes in a dialect that predates Latin. This is no longer about evil, it's about appetite." He was silenced soon after. That night, the church burned to the ground. Official cause: lightning strike. But witnesses swore they saw figures inside the blaze, tall silhouettes moving calmly through the fire as if it welcomed them. No bodies were ever recovered. What the fire didn't take, the town tried to forget. But forgetting isn't deletion, it's suppression. And suppression only feeds the rot. By midsummer, livestock were found mutilated with surgical precision. Cows opened like autopsy cadavers, hearts missing, stomachs intact but empty. No blood, not even a trail. Children's songs began changing too. On the playground, they no longer played tag. They reenacted the feast. One child would sit at the center, smiling unnaturally wide, while others pretended to serve invisible dishes made from dirt and feathers. The child in the center always ended the game the same way, tilting their head back and whispering, "I'm still hungry." Parents blamed imagination, trauma, media, anything but the truth claw, at the edge of their minds. The Bellows never left. They had simply grown roots so deep beneath Elmridge no fire or prayer could touch them. Some said they weren't a family at all, but a function, a need. The human form of famine given name, face and inheritance. What kind of hunger waits for 200 years to be fed? The kind that doesn't see flesh as meat or bone as structure, but as offering. And now, the seats were being set again, one by one. Fork, knife, candle, invitation. The invitations were never mailed. They simply appeared, on porches, under pillows, wedged between pages of Bibles long untouched. Cream-colored envelopes, sealed with black wax bearing the symbol of a fork, plunged through an eye. No names, no return address. Inside, a single sentence handwritten in ink so dark it seemed to shimmer red. "Your place at the table has been prepared." Most who received them never spoke of it. Those who did laughed nervously, claiming it was some sick prank. But laughter turned to silence when they saw that everyone had received one. Every household, every family, even children, especially children. Sheriff Walter Green tried to trace the paper. No manufacturer, no watermark. The ink, when tested, contained hemoglobin, human blood. When he ordered the envelopes burned, the flames refused to catch. Not a scorch, not a curl. They stayed cold, even under direct fire. That same night, his daughter disappeared. Her bed unwrinkled, window locked from the inside. On her pillow, a second envelope. She arrived early. That broke him. He left town the next morning and never returned, leaving his badge on the doorstep of the old courthouse, now abandoned like most buildings in Elmridge. But the town itself remained, like a patient host awaiting guests, and people kept arriving, not outsiders, but returners, descendants of the Bellows line called home by blood and dream. They came from Chicago, Baton Rouge, even Montreal, all drawn by visions of candlelit meals and whispers that tickled their ears in the night, telling them the courses must begin. These weren't modern people anymore. They came wearing antique clothing. They spoke in riddles, in mirrored speech, sometimes not at all. One man, identified only as Ellis Grant, stood in the middle of the town square and recited the same sentence for 3 hours. The marrow feeds the memory feeds the need. His mouth bled the entire time. No one stopped him. The local paper, long defunct, mysteriously printed a new edition that week, just one page, front and back, delivered in the dead of night. Headline: Feast Day. Announced all tables must be set by winter's first frost. No one admitted printing it, but everyone received it. And slowly the town began to shift. Old furniture returned to homes that hadn't seen life in decades. Dining rooms were cleaned, silverware polished, basements cleared, not for storage, but for seating. They were preparing, not for guests, but for something already there, already watching, already remembering who didn't eat last time. The first frost arrived early that year, blanketing the rooftops in a thin veil of ice that glowed silver under a cloudless sky. Elmridge had never looked so still, so preserved, like a town caught between breaths. No wind, no birds, not even the rustle of dry leaves, just silence so complete it pressed against the chest like weight. The Bellows house, still seated at the heart of town, stood brighter than ever, each window ablaze with candlelight, though no flame flickered. Inside, the table had grown. What once seated 10 now extended the length of the entire dining hall, snaking like a serpent through adjoining rooms, chairs added in uneven intervals, some wooden, others iron, one made of bone. The plates were already full, not with food, but with memories. Every item on every plate matched a specific last meal of someone who had died within the town, some recent, others going back over a century. A slice of rabbit pie, untouched since 1904, a glass of milk with a child's fingerprint frozen on the side, a red apple with a bite too small for an adult mouth. The dead were not returning to eat, they were returning to be remembered, to watch, to judge. That night, the returners came in pairs and groups, each dressed in ceremonial black, their mouths sewn shut with thread so thin it vanished in the candlelight. They sat, not speaking, not moving, just staring at the plates before them as if trying to summon something back into existence. And as the bells of midnight struck, not from any visible clock but from inside the walls, every candle extinguished at once. The darkness wasn't just absence of light, it was presence, thick, aware, breathing. And then came the sound, knives scraping plates, forks clicking teeth, but none of the living moved. It was the others, the ones in the shadows. Shapes began to fill the chairs left empty, figures without form, but with memory, and they ate. The scraping grew louder, more violent, more rhythmic. It was a ritual, a consumption of recollection, and for each bite taken, one of the returners would seize violently, choking on a phantom flavor, their eyes rolling back as if witnessing something ancient. Some collapsed, others simply vanished, leaving behind only steam rising from their clothes. And above it all, from the attic window of the Bellows house, a small girl stood watching, the same girl from the photograph. Her lips didn't move, but her voice was heard by all. "You came late. They've been waiting." In the days that followed, the town of Elmridge was no longer capable of pretending. The frost remained even when the sun rose. Children stopped speaking altogether, not out of fear, but as if their tongues had been claimed in the silence of that dinner. Local dogs howled constantly, digging holes in the frozen ground as if trying to uncover something buried beneath the foundations of their own homes. And at the Bellows house, the door was now always open. No one dared enter, yet every morning fresh footprints, small, wet and barefoot, could be seen leading in and out of the house. Pastor Clemens, the town's last spiritual guide, made the decision to cleanse the home, believing it had become an anchor for forces neither holy nor earthly. He gathered candles, salt, an old Bible bound in rusted chains, and entered just past dusk. He was never seen again, but the next morning, his Bible lay on the porch steps, torn open, every page blank, except for one word scrawled in blood at the center: remember. Inside the town records office, an intern named Mary Alcott began noticing peculiar patterns in the old census books. Generations of families simply vanished from record in specific years: 1841, 1866, 1904, 1939, 1973, each correlating with documented cold years in Elmridge's history. She followed the data like a trail of breadcrumbs, leading her to a single file long buried in the archives, a map, but not of the town above ground. It depicted a subterranean structure, tunnels, rooms, and one central chamber labeled only as the Eye. This underground system lay directly beneath the Bellows estate. According to the document, it was constructed in 1839, 1 year before the family ever arrived. That night, Mary returned to the house, alone. With only a lantern and the map, she stepped through the open door and made her way to the basement. The wooden steps creaked not from sure, but from recognition, as if the house knew her name. In the center of the basement was a circular hatch bolted with 9 rusted locks, yet none were engaged. She opened it. The air that escaped was warm, like breath from a sleeping beast. The tunnel below pulsed with a faint red glow. And just before she descended, she looked up to the basement mirror and saw them. Not her reflection, but every Bellows woman who had ever lived, watching her, waiting. One nodded, and Mary stepped into the dark. The moment Mary's boots touched the earth of the tunnel below, the air shifted as if the space had been waiting centuries for her arrival. The glow was not from torches or lanterns, but from the walls themselves. Veins of some mineral pulsing with slow, rhythmic light like a heartbeat, deep and ancient. The tunnel sloped downward at an impossible angle, yet she did not fall or stumble. It was as if her steps were being guided, not by sight or balance, but by something inside her that had just awakened. The map in her hand began to tremble, the ink bleeding across the paper, rearranging itself into new symbols, ones she had seen before but never learned. Glyphs her grandfather had carved into his cane before the war, the ones he whispered over her crib when no one else listened. The tunnel opened into a vast circular chamber. At its center stood a stone table, and above it, hanging in mid-air, was a suspended orb, a translucent sphere rotating silently, filled with flickering shadows. Around the room were alcoves, and in each stood a figure, not statues, bodies. Perfectly preserved, eyes open, breathing imperceptibly, each wearing garments from a different century. A child in colonial linen, a nurse from the Civil War, a woman in flapper dress, a soldier with a missing arm, and at the farthest alcove, an empty one. As Mary stepped closer to the orb, the room reacted. The shadows inside it twisted violently, and the figures in the alcoves all exhaled in unison, a sound that echoed like the last breath before drowning. She reached out. The moment her fingertips touched the sphere, a surge of memory, not hers but others, poured through her. Scenes of blood rituals, of secret gatherings beneath moonless skies, of decisions made centuries ago to preserve a bloodline meant to contain something, not nurture it. The Bellows weren't cursed, they were guardians. The family dinner wasn't insanity, it was ceremony. The dead weren't buried because they weren't gone. They were kept close, anchored to the living to maintain the lock on what lay beneath. Mary collapsed to her knees as the chamber began to hum. Behind her, the empty alcove was no longer empty. A mirror stood in its place. Her reflection stared back, but blinked out of sync. It smiled before she did. Then it mouthed two words she could not unhear. "Your turn." Mary's breath caught in her throat as the mirror pulsed with a deep red glow, her reflection no longer mimicking her but moving with independent intent, studying her like prey rather than a twin. The others in the alcoves, the sleeping guardians, now stirred with creaks of bone and ancient sighs, their eyes all fixed on her. Each was part of the lineage, and now so was she. The orb in the center dimmed and began to spin faster, like a storm collapsing in on itself, shadows forming the shapes of symbols she had only seen in forbidden books, stored in the high attic of her great-grandfather's estate, books her mother burned after his death. The ground quaked softly, rhythmically, as if reacting to her thoughts. In the silence that followed, a voice entered her mind, not heard, but felt. It told her what she already feared. The Bellows had struck a covenant with something older than the soil beneath their house, something that fed not on flesh or soul but on remembrance. The dead were not dead because forgetting them would loosen the lock, and if even one name faded from memory, the seal would fracture. That's why they ate dinner with them, preserved them, told their stories until the tales became scripture. Mary wasn't meant to discover this. She was meant to inherit it. Her great-uncle hadn't lost his mind when he tore out his own tongue. He'd been trying to silence the memory within himself, but Mary had seen too much. She backed away from the mirror, but it stepped forward. Her reflection now bled shadow, and where its eyes once were, there were only voids pulling inward. To remember is to bind. To forget is to release. The voice whispered again, deeper, almost loving. From the ceiling, black tendrils of smoke descended and wrapped around the orb, lowering it toward her chest. She felt warmth, not pain, but the kind of warmth that comes from surrendering, like falling asleep, deep in the cold. Her knees buckled and the figures in the alcove stepped down, forming a circle. A ritual was beginning, one that had waited for decades. The mirror reached its hand out to her, and as their fingers touched, her memories flashed behind her eyes. The whispering woods, the dinner with the dead, the song of the basement door creaking. This wasn't a nightmare. It was an initiation. Mary's fingers trembled as they touched the reflection's hand, but instead of feeling cold glass, she felt skin, dry, leathery, and pulsing faintly like it remembered being alive. The mirror self smiled, not with joy, but with grim satisfaction, as if a final piece had slid into place. Around her, the circle of ancestors began to hum, low and guttural, a vibration that made the wooden floor beneath her vibrate and moan. Their mouths did not move, yet their voices filled the chamber, each syllable carved from an ancient tongue that predated scripture. The orb hovered now between Mary and her twin, splitting its light into threads that wrapped around their chests, linking them in ways beyond flesh. Her memories, birthday candles, first kisses, the ache of grief, flashed again. But this time they drained from her like water down a spiral, sucked into the mirror self's eyes. Mary gasped. With every stolen memory, her reflection grew more vibrant, more alive, as she grew colder. This was the truth hidden by generations. The Bellows didn't preserve the dead to honor them. They preserved them to trap them, to anchor the price. The family had discovered how to barter with death, to negotiate an extension of life, but not for themselves, for a singular entity born in shadow, bound in the bloodline. Mary had been bred not to survive it, but to fuel it. Her body began to sway, no longer under her own control, and in that moment of terror she realized what her mother's final words had meant. Don't look in the mirror downstairs. It wasn't superstition, it was instruction. Too late now. The ritual surged, the orb hissed as it cracked open, revealing a pulsing black core that shot a line of energy into her chest. She screamed, but no sound came out. Her vocal cords didn't belong to her anymore. Her reflection whispered, "You are me now," and stepped fully through the mirror. The transformation was seamless. One Bellows descendant taken, another returned to the world wearing her skin. The circle broke. The dead stepped back into their alcoves satisfied. The orb faded. Mary's body, no, her former body, stood, smiled, and walked toward the staircase, her steps confident, ancient. Upstairs, the house was silent. The smell of dinner still hung in the air, and the empty chair at the table was gone. Sheriff Willard returned that evening not because he believed in ghosts or legends, but because something about the Bellows case refused to settle in his mind. The silence on their property felt unnatural, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. He parked his truck at the edge of the gravel and stepped out, flashlight in hand, boots crunching on the dirt. The house loomed ahead, shutters creaking gently in the wind, its windows dark except for one faint glow from the dining room. Willard's instinct told him to leave, to pretend he'd never set foot here, but curiosity pulled him forward. He knocked. No answer. The door creaked open on its own. "Hello, Mary," he called out, stepping inside. The air was cold, heavy. He felt it in his bones. As he entered the dining room, he stopped dead. The table was perfectly set. Plates, silverware, candles burned low. The Bellows family sat in their chairs, unmoving. But it wasn't decay he saw. They looked fresh, like they'd never died. Mary sat at the head, smiling. "Sheriff," she said, voice calm, welcoming. "We were just about to start dinner. Won't you join us?" He blinked, unsure what he was seeing. "Mary, I thought you were alone out here." She tilted her head, hands folded politely in her lap. "I was, but I'm not anymore." He glanced around. Something was wrong with their eyes, too glassy, too still, taxidermy with a heartbeat. Willard stepped back, reaching for his radio. Static, no signal. Mary stood slowly, walking toward him with fluid grace, like a dancer rehearsed for years. "You came all the way back here. That must mean you're ready." "Ready for what?" he asked, his voice cracking. "For the truth," she said, and extended her hand. He didn't take it. Behind her, the seated figures slowly turned their heads toward him in perfect unison. No blinking, No breathing. A sick smell of embalming fluid mixed with lavender and roasted meat. Willard backed into the hallway, but the shadows reached for him. He ran. Out the door, down the steps, into the woods. But the trees felt wrong now. Closer, hungrier. He tripped, fell, and looked up. There she was, Mary, or what wore her skin, smiling down at him. "It's your turn now, Sheriff," she whispered as darkness rushed in like a curtain falling on the final act. Willard woke up on the cold hardwood floor of the Bellows parlor, drenched in sweat, heart hammering like a drum. He sat up fast, reaching instinctively for his gun. But it was gone. So was his flashlight. The room was lit now, not by electricity but by candles placed in a perfect circle around him. Wax pooled like bleeding halos on the floor. In the doorway, Mary stood once more, but something in her eyes had changed. No longer warm or even hollow, they were simply absent. As though whatever had been pretending to be her was finished pretending. "You ran," she said, "but you came back. That matters." Willard tried to speak, but his throat was dry, tongue heavy. He crawled to the edge of the circle only to recoil as heat surged up from the wax. His hand blistered instantly. "You're not allowed to leave until it's done," Mary continued, stepping forward slowly, each motion too smooth, too rehearsed. "That's how the Bellows make peace." Behind her the parlor filled. No doors opened, no footsteps sounded, but suddenly the room was no longer empty. The entire Bellows family stood around the edges, watching, heads tilted, mouths slightly open like children marveling at a bedtime story. But their faces were wrong. Lips stitched, skin too tight, and eyes that flickered like candlelight behind frosted glass. "What do you want from me?" Willard croaked. Mary knelt beside him. "To see, to understand, to finish what was started." She pressed something into his palm, a spoon. Old, silver, engraved with the letter B. "Eat," she whispered. The dining room called to him again. He didn't walk there. He blinked, and he was seated at the long wooden table, a steaming bowl before him. The same soup, the one Clarice had once served, but now it smelled metallic, wrong. Willard looked down. Floating in the broth were pieces of something that should never be food. A tooth, a strip of leaf, eared skin, what looked like an eyelid. The Bellows sat around him again, waiting, watching. He tried to stand, but Mary's hand fell on his shoulder, pressing him down with surprising strength. "Eat," she repeated, "or join them empty." Willard raised the spoon with shaking fingers. As it neared his mouth, he understood. This wasn't about punishment, it was about transformation, about surrendering to something older, darker, and hidden in the bloodlines of forgotten families. He closed his eyes and took the first bite. The taste was beyond description, neither rancid nor savory, but something that bypassed his tongue entirely and went straight to his spine like a command. Willard dropped the spoon, gasping, as visions flooded his mind. He wasn't in the Bellows house anymore, not exactly. He saw the same parlor, but overlaid with flickers of time, moments stitched together in a brutal tapestry. There was 1840 again, Clarice Bellows weeping silently as she held a baby with no breath in its lungs. She refused to bury it. She placed it on the dinner table instead, surrounded by candles. Then came Reverend Josiah, holding a Bible and a scalpel. "We don't send them back empty," he whispered. The visions lurched forward, dinner after dinner, corpse after corpse, a sick ritual hidden beneath manners and linen napkins. The Bellows weren't just mourning, they were preserving, consuming, recycling the essence of their dead through grotesque communion. Willard saw young Mary force-fed spoonfuls of broth laced with her brother's ashes. He saw Isaac stitched up after death, his body positioned upright like a guest of honor. Then, an older Mary placing Willard's photo into a family album that smelled of mildew and flesh. He screamed himself awake back at the table, sweat-soaked and trembling. But the room had changed. Now only one Bellows remained. Mary. And she wasn't seated across from him. She was inside him. He felt her presence curling like smoke inside his chest, speaking in thoughts not his own. "Now you understand," she said through his thoughts. "You're one of us. You always were. You answered the invitation." He looked down at his hands and gasped. His fingers were wrong, too long, too thin, like someone else's bones lived beneath his skin. The soup bowl was gone. In its place was the family album, open to a new page. His photo was there, already aged, already yellowed. "What did you do to me?" And he growled. But the voice wasn't his anymore. It was deeper, hollowed out. Mary's whisper came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You asked what happened to the Bellows. You asked why no one remembered them. But how do you remember a family that never left? They just moved inward." The mirror on the far wall cracked, then shattered. Willard saw 1,000 reflections of himself, but not as he was, as he'd become. A Bellows by adoption, by possession, by hunger. And the worst part wasn't the horror. It was the calm, the peace that followed. Like coming home. Sheriff Langston had no idea what waited for him when he pulled up to the Bellows estate that fog-choked morning, shotgun resting across his lap and the weight of a dozen town complaints heavy on his shoulders. The neighbors had stopped pretending not to hear the chants at night, the flickering lights behind the curtained windows, the stench that curled across the cornfields like something long dead and recently awakened. Langston stepped out of his car, boots crunching on gravel as the house loomed before him, silent, grand, and humming with a frequency he couldn't hear but could feel deep in his molars. The front door was unlocked, no surprise there. Evil rarely bolted itself shut. Inside, the furniture stood untouched, the walls too clean, like someone had wiped away a century of dust in a single day. A smell clung to the air, rosemary, formaldehyde, and something sweet beneath it, like spoiled fruit. He called out, no response. But the moment he stepped into the dining room, he knew. The table was set for 12. Every place had a name card, and one of them read, Sheriff Langston. He backed away, pulse hammering. Then he heard it. Footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. Against all logic, against every bone screaming in his body, he ascended. The corridor was lined with portraits, but their faces had been scratched out. No, not scratched. Removed, cleanly, surgically. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar. Inside, the nursery, rocking horse, crib, and sitting in the center, Mary Bellows, not old, not young, but something outside of time. Her eyes were milk white, her dress the same blue she'd worn in the oldest portrait in town records. "You're late," she said, voice neither warm nor cold. "We've already begun supper." Langston raised his shotgun, but his arms betrayed him. They wouldn't lift. He felt them go slack as if strings had been cut. Mary rose without E. Sheriff Langston stood frozen before the place setting that bore his name, the silverware gleaming like polished bones, the plate cold to the touch and carved with symbols he'd only ever seen in the fringe texts locked away in his uncle's attic. He didn't remember sitting down. One moment he was standing, the next, his hands rested calmly on the linen napkin folded perfectly in his lap, and the heavy chair cradled his spine like it had been built just for him. Around the table, the once empty seats were no longer vacant. The Bellows family sat in full attendance. None breathed, none blinked. All watched. Mary now stood at the head of the table, her eyes pale as fog, arms open in some grotesque parody of grace. "Tonight," she said, "we remember the living. It is the hardest thing we do." A slow clapping began. Not applause, but ritual. Rhythmic. Measured. Each member of the family joined in. The sound bounced against the walls, made Langston's heart stutter in his chest. Then came the shrouded figures, servants or specters, emerging from the shadows with silver trays. Each cloche was lifted in unison. The scent of decay disguised beneath spices flooded the room. On each plate, a perfect replica of human organs, arranged like haute cuisine. Langston's was different. His dish contained a heart, his own. He knew it with a certainty that collapsed reason. still beating, still warm, like it had just been removed. "This is the moment," Mary said, stepping closer, "where you must choose, eat, and become part of the memory, or refuse, and become part of the soil." He tried to speak, but no sound came. The room itself waited. His hand moved without permission, lifted the fork, trembled above the plate. The family smiled. Their teeth were wrong. Too many, too white, too sharp. Then came a sound, far away at first, then growing louder. A church bell, tolling once, then twice. Mary's far. He contorted. Not fear, not anger, but something like hunger denied. The sound grew louder, closer. She stepped back. The Bellows family vanished one by one, flickering like candle flames in the wind. Langston found himself alone. No plate, no smell, no Mary. Only the bell tolling its final chime. But when he turned to leave, the door was no longer a door. It was a mirror. And in its reflection, he was no longer himself. He was wearing Mary's dress, and the smile on his face was not his own. Langston staggered backward from the mirror, his breath caught in his throat, the silk of the dress clinging to his skin like a second layer of flesh he hadn't asked for. The reflection didn't move as he did. Instead, it remained frozen, smiling, its head tilting just a second too late, like it was waiting for permission. Behind the glass, the reflection began to darken, like smoke filling water, until the mirror bled black and shimmered with images not of this world. He saw the Bellows family, generation after generation, seated at tables in centuries gone by, always with one stranger in their midst, always wearing that same dress. It wasn't fabric, it was a ritual, a vessel, and it chose a new host every few decades. He saw men in top hats, Confederate soldiers, school teachers, a priest with trembling hands, all wearing it, all seated in that same chair, all with that same expression of horror, turning slowly to surrender. The mirror hissed. It didn't crack, it didn't break. It breathed. And then it spoke, not aloud, but directly into Langston's skull, in a voice that wasn't a voice, but a chorus of every Bellows who had ever died and never truly left. "You have taken memory into your body. You are the keeper now." His hands rose again, puppet-like, tracing the embroidered patterns on the gown, symbols stitched in thread so fine it could only be spider silk. One by one, the candles in the room extinguished themselves, snuffed out by a cold that moved like a thought through the air. He felt it wrap around his spine and whisper through his ribs. Then a book opened itself on the table, a leather-bound tome that hadn't been there before. On its pages were names. Hundreds, thousands. At the very bottom of the last page, a new name etched itself slowly, Thaddeus Langston. It glowed briefly, then dried into black ink, and beneath it, Keeper of the Feast. The walls groaned, the mire roar shattered, and in its place stood another door, carved with faces, all mouthing the same phrase over and over. Memory must be fed. He knew what came next. The next knock on that door, the next drifter, the next curious sheriff or hungry soul would sit at the table as he had, and he would greet them with the same smile, with the same dress, because the Bellows family was never gone. The townsfolk never saw Langston again. His badge remained on the desk, polished and gleaming as though untouched by time, yet no one dared to step foot inside the Bellows house after that night. Whispers circled like carrion birds. Some claimed they heard music from inside, a faint waltz playing on loop, distorted like an old phonograph trying to resurrect a song long since dead. Others said they saw candlelight in the windows, flickering shadows moving like dancers across the lace curtains, and a few swore they glimpsed someone in a long dress standing motionless in the parlor, waiting, always waiting. But when the mayor finally sent 2 men to demolish the place, contractors from out of town who didn't carry the weight of local fear, they came back wrong. They didn't speak. Their eyes were hollow as if they'd seen too much and understood even less. One had carved something into the cab of his truck. Feast still warm. And just like that, the Bellows home was cordoned off for good. Nature tried to reclaim it. Vines crawled the walls. Trees leaned in close. But they never touched the foundation. It was as if even the earth itself knew to keep its distance. Meanwhile, Langston's name began to fade from memory, not because people forgot, but because they were made to forget. Every record, every file, every photo dissolved like ash in the wind. Even his own sister, who came searching, arrived in town to find no one remembered her brother at all. And when she insisted on seeing the Bellows house for herself, she walked through the gate and was never seen again. A child, curious and foolish, peeked through a cracked shutter days later and claimed he saw a woman in a lavender gown dancing in slow circles inside, arms outstretched like she was holding someone invisible. When asked if he was sure, the boy nodded, trembling. She had the same face as the sheriff in the newspaper. Air clipping. But she wasn't a man anymore. The town learned then that some stories don't end. They simply find new actors. The house didn't rot. It didn't crumble. It simply existed, untouched, immune to time. Because memory, once invited, never leaves. And the Bellows family didn't need to haunt the town. The town haunted itself, with the silence, with the absence, with the unspoken truth that something unnatural lived just past the edge of reason, and it was always hungry. They tried once more, years later, to cleanse the land, not with bulldozers or fire, but with faith. A preacher from out of state, young and full of fury, came with a Bible in one hand and a wooden cross in the other. He stood outside the gate at dawn and began to shout prayers into the stillness. The townsfolk gathered behind him, emboldened by his conviction, hoping this would be the end, hoping to finally erase the wound the Bellows had carved into their soil. But as the sun rose higher, the preacher's voice began to change, first trembling, then cracking, then finally dropping into a whisper only he seemed to understand. He stared into the upper window where the curtains didn't move, where no breeze ever touched, and his mouth opened slowly. He began repeating a phrase. "They're still seated." Over and over, voice flat, as if possessed. He walked calmly through the gate, ignored every warning cry behind him, and stepped through the front door. It shut behind him with the sound of something ancient locking. The crowd dispersed. No one tried again. The town learned to move around the house, to pretend it didn't exist, to teach children not to ask and tourists not to look. A road was rerouted. Maps were altered. The Bellows house became a blind spot in reality, erased in every way except the one that mattered. Memory. And yet, when the fog rolled in thick over the river, it always curled around that house like it was being pulled inward, devoured. Inside, they say, the dining room remains set, plates untouched, napkins folded, 4 chairs still occupied, their faces never rot, their bodies never age, just sitting there in some unspeakable ritual of waiting, as though dinner never ended, as though their final act, whatever horror it was, bound them to that table forever. But the 5th chair, the one at the head, sits empty, waiting, reserved, and every generation, someone It's too close, hears the whisper, feels the pull. Some vanish, some return different, and some begin setting their own tables in the same way, one empty chair at the head, waiting for a guest who's not alive, not dead, just forgotten. You've heard the story now. The question is, was it an echo or an invitation? And if you feel like someone's been watching while you listened, someone behind you just out of reach, don't turn around. They only move when you look.